For 25 years, I thought my wife loved me. I worked 16-hour days to give her the world. But one evening, outside my daughter's house, I heard her voice through the window. She was laughing with my son-in-law, laughing about how they'd take everything from me the moment I signed the divorce papers. That laugh still haunts me. But so does the sound of their downfall. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, if you've ever been blindsided by betrayal, then you'll feel every word of this story. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're re-listening from, because what I am about to share might just be the most satisfying revenge you'll hear all the day. For 25 years, I lived under the belief that my marriage was strong, solid, unshakable. If anyone had asked me back then, I would have said Margaret and I were partners, that we shared the kind of bond people dreamed of but rarely found. I wasn't a perfect husband, no one is, but I worked like hell to provide her with a life of comfort and stability, and I truly believed she appreciated it. My name's Alan, and I run a construction company, Cole Construction. It started small, just me, a beat-up pickup truck, and a few tools I could barely afford. Back then, Margaret used to tell me how proud she was that I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty, that I was building not just homes, but a future for us. Those words lit a fire in me, a fire that pushed me through 16-hour days, through nights spent poring over blueprints, through weekends when I should have been resting but instead found myself chasing contracts. And it worked. Little by little, brick by brick, I built something real. Today, Cole Construction is worth over $12 million on paper. We own rental properties, a vacation home by the lake, investment portfolios. People in town know my name. They know me as the guy who never gave up, who clawed his way out of nothing and made something lasting. But here's the thing no one tells you. Success doesn't just build wealth, it builds blind spots. When you're so focused on providing, you stop looking closely at what you already have. You assume the people you love are rooting for you, not plotting against you. Margaret was beautiful when I met her. Sharp, witty, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone stop mid-conversation. I fell hard, the way only a young man can fall. I was 23, fresh out of trade school, chasing construction gigs wherever I could find them. She was 21, working at a boutique, saving up for community college. We weren't rich, but we were in love, or at least, I thought we were. Her father hated me from the start, said I was just a dirty laborer, who would never amount to anything. He didn't even come to our wedding. I remember Margaret crying about that, and I swore to myself I would prove him wrong. I would give her the life he thought I couldn't, and I did. We had one daughter, Brianna. She was our pride and joy. If you've ever raised a daughter, you know the kind of tenderness it brings out of a man. She was the one who convinced me to take weekends off sometimes, the one who would climb into my lap with her crayons while I studied blueprints, telling me she was helping Daddy build. Fast forward to adulthood, Brianna grew into a brilliant woman, driven and compassionate. She married Dan, a young lawyer who seemed, at least on the surface, like he had his act together. I can't say I ever fully warmed up to him. Something about the way he carried himself, the smugness tucked behind his polite smile, rubbed me the wrong way. But for Brianna's sake, I held my tongue. My wife, Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to adore him. Too much. In hindsight, life at home wasn't perfect, but it was routine. Margaret and I had our disagreements. She complained that I worked too much, that I was married to the business instead of to her. Maybe she wasn't wrong, but I always thought she understood why I did it for us. For our daughter, for the security her own family had denied her when she was younger. Every time I signed a new contract or closed on a property, I thought I was proving my love in the only way I knew how, by building something lasting. But looking back, I see now that Margaret's smiles were more practiced than genuine. Her words of encouragement were laced with calculation I was too naive to recognize. The truth is, while I was out there building empires, she was busy building her own plans. You see, when you've been married 25 years, you stop questioning the little things. When she started taking longer shopping trips, I assumed she just enjoyed the freedom I'd worked so hard to give her. When she grew quieter at dinner, I thought she was tired. When she started spending more time with Brianna and Dan, I thought it was just family bonding. The truth was uglier. At the time, though I lived in ignorance, our house was beautiful, our bank accounts healthy, our daughter thriving. On the outside, we looked like the picture of success, a family who had it all. Inside, I was tired but proud, a man who believed he'd fulfilled his promises. If there were cracks, I couldn't see them yet. Or maybe I refused to look too closely. I remember one evening in particular, not long before everything unraveled. We were sitting on the porch, Margaret sipping her wine, me nursing a beer. The sun was setting behind the oak trees we'd planted 20 years earlier. She turned to me and said, almost wistfully, "Alan, you really have built me a kingdom." I smiled, thinking it was a compliment. But the way she said it, the coldness just beneath the words, should have been my first clue. I didn't know then that the kingdom I thought I'd built for her was nothing more than a goldmine she planned to strip bare. It started like any other Tuesday. I'd wrapped up a long day at the office, blueprints scattered across my desk, phone calls from contractors ringing in my ears. Normally, I'd head straight home, maybe pour myself a stiff drink, and collapse in the recliner I'd practically made my throne. But that evening, something tugged at me. A small voice in my gut whispered, "Go check on Brianna." She'd been stressed lately, working long hours at her new practice. I figured I'd surprise her, maybe take her out for dinner, just the two of us. A father-daughter night. It had been too long. So I dialed her number. "Hey sweetheart," I said, smiling as I merged onto the road that would take me past her place. "How about I swing by? We can grab dinner, my treat." There was a pause on the other end. Then her cheerful voice came through. "Sorry, Dad, I'm not home tonight. I'm meeting a friend for dinner. But Dan's around, working on some case files." I told her no problem, to enjoy her evening, and hung up. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but as I drove past her neighborhood, that voice in my gut grew louder. "Just check. Just drive by." And that's when I saw it. Parked in Brianna's driveway, bold as brass under the glow of the street lamp, was Margaret's car. A shiny silver Lexus, the same one that should have been sitting in our garage at home. My hands tightened on the wheel. My chest constricted like someone had looped a chain around it and pulled hard. What's she doing here? I pulled over a few houses down, engine idling, eyes locked on that Lexus. A dozen rational explanations flew through my mind. Maybe she'd dropped something off. Maybe she and Brianna had plans earlier and she just left her car there. But none of it fit. Brianna wasn't home, and Margaret hadn't mentioned a word about coming here. The longer I sat there, the stronger the unease grew. Finally, I killed the engine, slipped the keys into my pocket, and got out of the truck. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through wet cement, but I forced myself forward, one step at a time, toward the glow spilling from Brianna's living room window. The curtains weren't fully drawn, just enough of a gap for light and voices to leak through. I crept closer, heart pounding so hard I swore it echoed against the brick wall. That's when I heard it. When the old fool finally signs the papers, Margaret's voice drifted out. Smooth and venomous. "We'll have everything we planned for." I froze. My body went cold, blood rushing to my ears in a roar. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. That couldn't be her. That couldn't be my wife of 25 years talking about me like that. But then Dan's voice cut in, sharp and smug. "The timeline's perfect. File in June, claim irreconcilable differences. With the new Iowa statutes, you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, plus spousal support for life." A laugh followed, Margaret's laugh. That delicate tinkling I used to love, the sound that had once felt like home. Now it cut through me like glass. "The construction business alone is worth $12 million, she said. "Add the rentals, the vacation home, investments. We're looking at nearly $20 million total." I stumbled back against the wall, pressing a hand to my mouth to stifle the ragged sound clawing its way out of me. 20 million, she wasn't just leaving me, she was gutting me alive, financially, emotionally, every which way. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, swiping blindly until the record button lit up red. I raised it, angling it toward the crack in the curtains, desperate to capture every poisonous word spilling from their mouths. Don continued, his voice calm, calculated. "The beautiful part is his trusting nature. Alan has no idea we've been documenting his assets for months. Bank statements, property deeds, business valuations, it's all already copied." He gestured toward a manila folder on the coffee table. He practically handed us the keys to his kingdom. Margaret leaned back on the couch, like a queen on her throne, examining her manicured nails. 2 years of playing the devoted wife, pretending to care about his boring construction stories, nodding sympathetically when he worried about payroll. God, the man actually believes I love him. Her words gutted me more than any knife could. My throat burned, my knees buckled, forcing me to brace myself against the wall. 25 years. 25 years of my life poured into this woman, and she reduced it all to an act. Just then, my foot snapped a twig in the grass. Both their heads whipped toward the window. Dan's eyes narrowed, scanning the yard. I pressed myself flat against the brick, breath trapped in my chest, praying they wouldn't see me. "Did you hear that?" Margaret's voice was sharp, laced with fear. "Probably just the neighbor's cat," Don muttered after a pause. "You're paranoid. Can you blame me? If Alan discovered this before, we're ready." "He won't," Dan cut her off. The man couldn't spot a conspiracy if it wore a neon sign. His laugh followed, cruel and dismissive. "By September, you'll be divorced, wealthy, and free to do whatever you want with whoever you want." I stayed frozen in the shadows, barely daring to breathe, while their voices rose and fell, plotting the destruction of everything I'd built. My phone captured it all, every detail, every venomous admission. 15 minutes later, I crept back to my truck, moving like a ghost. My hands shook so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I sat there, staring at them, the same hands that had built an empire brick by brick, the same hands that had lifted Margaret up when her own family cast her aside. the same hands that had walked her down the aisle when her father refused to. Now, they were fists clenched tight around a steering wheel, veins bulging with betrayal. Margaret's words echoed in my skull. The man actually believes I love him. And in that moment, I realized I'd been living a lie. The woman I'd devoted my life to, the daughter I'd sacrificed weekends with, the empire I'd built from sweat and blood, was all nothing more than ammunition in their war against me. My kingdom wasn't just under siege, it had already been invaded. When I finally pulled into my own driveway that night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the engine. I just sat there, staring at the garage door where Margaret's Lexus should have been parked, the engine humming under my shaking hands. My entire body felt like it didn't belong to me, like I was floating outside myself, watching a man whose life had just imploded. I didn't even remember getting out of the truck, or unlocking the front door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the house dark and silent, except for the faint tick of the clock on the wall. The recording on my phone sat heavy in my pocket. I couldn't listen to it again, not yet. It was enough that her words already echoed endlessly in my head. God, the man actually believes I love him. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the poison of her voice had already seeped too deep. Every syllable cut into me, replaying like a broken record I couldn't escape. I thought about the years we'd shared, the anniversaries, the family vacations, the quiet nights where I believed we were at peace. How many of those moments had been genuine? How many had just been rehearsed lines in a script Margaret had perfected while waiting for the right time to betray me? The thought nearly broke me. At some point, I must have poured myself a drink, because I found a half-empty glass of bourbon sweating on the table. I don't even remember drinking it. I just remember staring at it, my reflection distorted in the amber liquid, wondering if the man looking back at me was a fool, because that's what I was, a fool. The next few days blurred together. I went to work, because work was the only place where my mind could focus on something other than Margaret Eslath, Dan's smug voice, the image of that manila folder stuffed with my life's work. But even then, I caught myself zoning out in meetings, forgetting what project we were on, staring at my employees like they were strangers. At home, the silence was unbearable. Every room felt tainted. Every photograph of us together turned into a mockery. I couldn't look at her face, smiling back at me from the frame on the mantel. I wanted to smash it, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Margaret pretended nothing was wrong. She'd crawl in beside me, smelling faintly of perfume and betrayal. And I'd force myself to stay still, to breathe evenly, to not let on that I knew, because if I confronted her too soon, I'd lose any chance of fighting back. But God, it was torture. One night, maybe 3 days after I'd overheard them, I found myself gripping the bathroom sink so hard my knuckles turned white. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger's sunken eyes, gray stubble, a mouth twisted in silent fury. And for the first time, a thought slipped into my mind. What if I just walked away? What if I let them have it all? The business, the money, the properties. What if I packed a bag, disappeared, and let them choke on their ill-gotten riches? But the thought died as quickly as it came. Because I knew Margaret. I knew Dan. They wouldn't stop at taking what I had. They'd gloat. They'd spin the story until I was the villain, the workaholic husband who drove her away, the clueless father too blinded to see the truth. They'd paint me as weak. And weakness, I realized, was the one thing I couldn't stomach. I'd given Margaret 25 years of my life. I'd given Dan the benefit of the doubt, for Brianna's sake, and this was how they repaid me. No, walking away wasn't an option. That was the night something inside me shifted. The broken pieces of me started to harden into something sharper, stronger. My grief began to calcify into resolve. I dug the phone out of my pocket and replayed the recording for the first time since I decaptured it. Their voices filled the quiet of the bathroom, echoing against the tile. Margaret's mocking tone, Dan's smug instructions, the sound of betrayal in stereo. But this time, instead of breaking me, it steeled me. They'd spent months planning to strip me of everything. They thought I'd never see it coming. They thought I was too blind, too trusting, too weak to fight back. They were wrong, because if there's one thing I know, it's how to build. And if I could build a business from nothing, brick by brick, then I could build a plan to destroy theirs. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad, writing down everything I knew, every asset they mentioned, every timeline they laid out. My pen tore through the paper sometimes, driven by the fury in my hand. By the time the sun rose, I had the beginnings of a plan. For years, Margaret had underestimated me. She saw me as nothing more than a provider, a man who worked himself to the bone so she could live in luxury. She never understood that underneath the dirt and sweat, I was a strategist. Every successful project I'd built required careful planning, foresight, and the ability to anticipate problems before they arose. And now, Margaret and Dan had just handed me their blueprint. The folder on that coffee table haunted me. Yes, but it also comforted me, because it told me they thought they were ahead of me. They thought they'd already won, and that arrogance would be their downfall. For the first time since that night at Brianna's house, I felt something other than despair. I felt clarity. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, a new fire had sparked. A fire fueled not by grief, but by the promise of justice. They wanted a war. Fine, but I'd be damned if I went into it unarmed, and I had the perfect weapon. The truth. If there's one thing I learned from building coal construction, it's that no project succeeds without a plan. You can't just show up with bricks and steel and expect a skyscraper to rise. You need blueprints. You need patience. You need to see 10 steps ahead. Margaret and Don had their blueprint. They thought they'd drawn the perfect map to my ruin. But the moment I recorded that conversation, I had something they didn't expect. Proof. Proof of their greed, their lies, their conspiracy. And with proof, I could draw my own blueprint. I started with evidence. The recording on my phone was explosive, but I knew it couldn't be my only weapon. Courts don't always smile kindly on recordings made without consent. If I wanted to crush them legally, financially, and personally, I needed layers of protection. So, I began quietly collecting everything. Bank statements, property deeds, copies of contracts. Every document they thought they'd already secured, I made sure I had originals tucked safely away. I opened a private safe deposit box at a bank Margaret didn't know about, storing every piece of paper like gold bars. Next came surveillance. Dan had bragged about documenting my assets for months. That told me he'd been sloppy, maybe even reckless, in covering his own tracks. So I hired a private investigator, a guy named Mitchell, an old friend of mine who owed me a favor. He was discreet, sharp, and most importantly, loyal. Follow them, I told him. Don't make a move, don't confront, just watch. Document everything, where they meet, who they talk to, where the money flows. Within a week, Mitchell delivered photographs of Margaret and Dan at restaurants, sitting far too close in the booth for in-laws. Images of them leaving hotels, Dan's hand low on her back. A paper trail showing Dan funneling money out of his law firm accounts over $127,000 unaccounted for. Each file Mitchell handed me was another nail in their coffin. Meanwhile, at home, I played my role. I smiled. I asked Margaret about her day. I let her kiss me goodnight, though I turned my face just slightly so her lips brushed my cheek instead of my mouth. She didn't notice. She thought she still had me fooled. Sometimes, when she laughed at something on TV, I had to leave the room. The sound was too close to the one I'd heard through Brianna's window, the laugh that now felt like the soundtrack to my humiliation. But I forced myself to endure it, because every false smile, every shared dinner, was time I used to tighten the noose. At work, I made subtle shifts. I moved certain assets into protected trusts. I changed signatory authority on key accounts. Quietly, without fanfare, I ensured that if Margaret tried to seize control, she'd find herself locked out. I also paid a visit to my lawyer, Richard Harper. He'd been with me since the early days of the company, a man whose integrity I trusted like my own blood. Sitting in his office, I slid the phone across the desk, letting him hear Margaret and Dan's voices drip with contempt. When the recording ended, Richard leaned back, eyes wide. "Alan, this is dynamite. I need to be ready," I told him. "When they move, I want to be 3 steps ahead." Richard nodded slowly. "We can do better than that. We can turn their plan inside out, let them think they're winning. And when the time comes," he smiled thinly, "we'll bury them." That became the strategy. Patience and timing. Let them believe their scheme was airtight. Let them grow overconfident. And then, when they struck, I'd detonate everything at once. The hardest part was keeping it from Brianna, my sweet daughter, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her father. I couldn't drag her into this storm, not yet. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes. Because if I told her outright, she might not believe me. Love makes fools of us all. So I waited. I pretended. I played the long game. Weeks passed. Margaret's behavior grew bolder. She stayed out later, always with flimsy excuses. Dan started calling the house more often, his voice smug when he thought I wasn't listening. Each time, I bit back the urge to explode. Instead, I jotted notes in my growing file. Every detail mattered. Every lie, every omission, every betrayal, they were all bricks in the wall I was building. A fortress that would protect me when the storm broke. One night, Margaret came home flushed and smiling. Her hair mussed just enough to tell a story. She poured herself a glass of wine, humming as she moved around the kitchen. "Long day?" I asked, my voice casual. "The longest," she sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Shopping with Brianna. You know how exhausting that girl can be?" I smiled faintly, swirling the ice in my glass. Brianna had called me that afternoon. She'd been at the office all day, buried in back-to-back sessions. It took everything in me not to laugh at the audacity. That was when I realized something important. Margaret wasn't just betraying me, she was underestimating me. She thought I was blind, stupid, too wrapped up in my work to notice the cracks. And that arrogance, that certainty would be her undoing. By the end of May, I had everything I needed. Evidence of the affair. Proof of financial misconduct. Legal documentation protecting my assets. Allies who knew the truth. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for Margaret and Dan to spring it. And deep down, a part of me almost hoped they would. Because when they did, they wouldn't just fail, they'd fall hard, and I'd be there. Not as the fool they imagined, but as the architect of their downfall. The letter came on a Wednesday. A thick envelope, stamped with the name of Dan's law firm. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. Margaret had finally decided to make her move. I waited until I was in my office. The heavy oak door locked behind me, before I slit the envelope open. Sure enough, there it was. The official petition for divorce. Filed by my wife, represented by none other than Daniel Carson, my son. I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers, a slow smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. So it begins. The demands were laughable. Half of the business, half of the properties. Spousal support on top of that. The petition read less like a legal document and more like a shopping list written by a greedy child. Dan had made it clear in the margins notes about controlling interest, liquidation options, and rapid settlement leverage. In other words, they thought I'd roll over. They thought I'd panic, desperate to avoid scandal or courtroom drama. But I didn't panic. I didn't feel fear. What I felt was cold, steady resolve. I called Richard Harper, my lawyer, and forwarded him the documents. Within the hour, we were sitting across from each other, coffee steaming between us. They've overplayed, Richard said, flipping through the papers with a smirk. These demands won't hold in court. Not even close. I don't want to just win, I told him. I want them ruined. I want them exposed for what they are. Richard leaned back, studying me. Then we'll need to be patient. Let them think you're cornered. And when they get comfortable, he tapped the table with his pen. We'll gut them. So that's what we did. Margaret served me the papers that evening at dinner, sliding them across the table as though she were passing me the salt. I think this is for the best, Alan, she said, her voice calm, rehearsed. We've grown apart. It's time we move on. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had shared my bed for 25 years. The woman I had sacrificed for, built a life with. And now, sitting across from me, her eyes held no love, no regret, only calculation. I nodded slowly, keeping my face unreadable. If that's what you want, Margaret, inside I was already 3 steps ahead. The weeks that followed were a theater of deceit. Margaret moved into a townhouse temporarily, though I knew from Mitchell's reports that she spent most nights in hotels with Dan. Dan played the role of shark lawyer, sending aggressive letters, pushing for quick settlements. And me, I played the role of beaten husband. I let my shoulders slump. I let my voice crack with practiced weariness. I showed up to mediation sessions looking tired, distracted. Margaret glowed during those meetings, dressed to perfection, her hand brushing Dan's accidentally under the table when she thought no one noticed. She believed she was winning. But behind the mask, I was cataloging everything, every lie, every slip, every smug grin Dan flashed when he thought he had me cornered. The first crack appeared during the third mediation. Dan had prepared financial statements meant to corner me. Documents, he insisted, showed my assets ripe for division. But Richard calmly slid his own folder across the table. Funny thing, Daniel, he said smoothly. These records don't align with the official filings from the state. Care to explain the discrepancies? Dan's face drained of color. He stammered something about clerical errors, but the damage was done. Margaret's smile faltered. That was the moment I knew they weren't as invincible as they believed. By late June, the case escalated toward trial. Margaret was impatient, pressuring Dan to finish it quickly. She wanted her payday. She wanted to stand on the ashes of my empire and call it freedom. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor. The night before our first court appearance, I sat alone in my study, reviewing the mountain of evidence Mitchell and I had compiled. Photos, bank records, hotel receipts, the audio recording of Margaret and Dan plotting my downfall. It was all there, neatly organized in binders. I thought about Brianna. She still didn't know. I had kept her out of it, shielded her from the ugliness. But tomorrow, in court, she would see it all. The truth would crash down on her like thunder, and she would finally understand the depth of her husband's betrayal. I hated that she would hurt, but I hated more the idea of her living under Dan's lies. So I made peace with it. The next morning, court was packed. Margaret walked in like a queen, entering her coronation, Dan striding beside her, smug as ever. He glanced at me, a glint of victory in his eyes. I met his gaze, calm, steady. He didn't know that by the end of the day, that look would be gone. Richard opened with quiet confidence, dismantling their claims, piece by piece. When Dan objected, Richard countered effortlessly, his tone almost amused. Margaret shifted in her seat, growing restless. Then, when the time was right, Richard gestured toward me. Your Honor, my client has additional evidence that speaks directly to the credibility of both opposing counsel and the petitioner. Dan stiffened. Margaret frowned, confused. Richard pressed play, and there it was, the recording, their voices filling the courtroom. Margaret, laughing, Dan, plotting. Words that dripped with greed and betrayal. The room fell silent, except for the sound of their conspiracy playing on loop. Margaret's face went pale. Dan's mouth hung open. And me. I sat there, watching them unravel, the blueprint finally blooming into reality. The trap had sprung. The courtroom was never truly silent, not with the faint hum of air conditioning and the shuffle of papers. But in that moment after Richard pressed play, it felt like every molecule in the air froze. Margaret's laugh echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Dan's voice, sharp and smug, followed. He'll never see it coming. Once he signs, we'll bleed him dry. Brianna won't suspect a thing. She'll thank us when it's over. The judge's brow furrowed, his gavel striking once. Order, but there was no order. Not in that room, not in their faces. Margaret's composure cracked like thin ice. Her hand clutched the edge of the table, knuckles white. Dan looked as if someone had reached into his chest and stolen his lungs. For the first time in months, I didn't have to fake my calm. I sat there, still and steady, as the weight of their own words crushed them. Mr. Carson, the judge said, fixing Dan with a glare. This recording raises serious ethical concerns, particularly given your role as counsel. We will be addressing this matter in due course. Don stammered. Your Honor, that audio is taken out of context. Context? Richard interrupted smoothly. You mean the context of conspiring to defraud my client while abusing your position as both officer of the court and son-in-law? Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was a scandal brewing in real time. Margaret turned to Dan, whispering harshly. I couldn't hear her words, but her expression screamed betrayal. She had expected him to carry her to victory. Instead, he was sinking her with him. The judge postponed the hearing, citing the need to review the evidence. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Margaret and Dan had been exposed, their perfect scheme bleeding out in front of everyone. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. Mr. Whitaker, did you know about your wife's affair with your son-in-law, Alan? Do you plan to press charges? Sir, is it true they conspired to steal your company? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The story was already writing itself, and the more they speculated, the deeper Margaret and Dan sank. By the next morning, the headlines blared. Local attorney under investigation for conflict of interest. Prominent businesswoman caught in marital scandal. Family feud turns into courtroom bombshell. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, watching their empire crumble on the morning news. Margaret had been forced to move out of the townhouse. Dan's firm had suspended him pending investigation. And suddenly, all her high society friends stopped answering her calls. Brianna was the one I couldn't stop thinking about. She came to see me 2 nights after court. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee cup she didn't drink from. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking. Is it true? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I slid one of the binders across the table, the one I'd deliberately kept out of court. Photos, receipts, proof beyond question. She flipped through a few pages, her face draining with each turn. By the 4th page, her tears fell silently onto the paper. I didn't want you to see it like this, I said softly, but you needed to know. Her shoulders shook. How could they? How could Mom? How could Dan? I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. Because greed blinds people. Because they wanted more than what they had. And they thought stepping on you, on me was the way to get it. Her tears hardened into something else. Anger, betrayal, the fire I'd once seen in her as a child, when she'd stand up to playground bullies, flickered back to life. I hate him, she whispered. I shook my head. Don't waste your hate on him. Just don't let him win. She nodded slowly, clutching the binder like a shield. Meanwhile, Margaret and Dan's relationship began to rot under the pressure. Mitchell kept me updated arguments in hotel lobbies, shouting matches caught on grainy phone recordings. Margaret blamed Dan for being careless, for letting the recording exist. Dan blamed Margaret for pushing too hard, too fast. It was delicious, watching them devour each other. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Richard and I filed a motion requesting that the court freeze marital assets pending resolution. With Dan under investigation by the Bar Association, his credibility was gone. The judge granted it without hesitation. Margaret's access to money evaporated overnight. She tried calling me, left voicemails that swung wildly between fury and desperation. Alan, you can't do this to me. After everything I've given you, don't think you've won. I'll find another lawyer. Please, Alan, I don't have anywhere to go, just please. I saved every voicemail, not to use in court, just as a reminder of how far she'd fallen. Within weeks, Dan's law license was suspended pending a formal hearing. His partners cut him loose to save face. Margaret, once the darling of Charity Gallus, was whispered about at country clubs, her name spoken with pity and scorn. The perfect couple they'd tried to present had been stripped bare, revealed as nothing more than a pair of parasites feeding on each other. But I wasn't finished. Because revenge isn't just about winning, it's about making sure they never forget the cost of crossing you. So I set the final stage. Mitchell found out Margaret had taken out a personal loan, desperate to maintain her lifestyle while her assets were frozen. The lender, predatory, the kind that thrives on desperation. I bought the debt, quietly, through a third party, which meant that, when the time came, Margaret wouldn't just lose the divorce case, she'd owe me, directly. And Don's reputation was already in ashes. But I had one more card to play. One more humiliation that would ensure he could never crawl back into the world he thought he owned. I sat back in my chair one evening, binder open before me, listening again to Margaret's laugh, Dan's arrogance. They had written their own downfall. I had simply played the recording. And soon, the world would hear the encore. When people fall from grace, it's rarely sudden. Most of the time, it's a slow slight pride stripped away layer by layer until there's nothing left. But for Margaret and Dan, their fall was a free fall. One moment they were untouchable, the next they were gasping for air, clawing at the walls of a pit they'd dug themselves. And I was there at the edge, watching, waiting. The divorce trial reconvened 2 months later. By then, Margaret had no real legal team left. Dan's suspension had cut off her strongest weapon. She tried to hire another attorney, but every reputable firm wanted nothing to do with her case. She settled for someone green, someone cheap, and it showed. Richard leaned over to me before the judge entered. This is going to be quick. She has no footing left. He was right. When proceedings began, Richard presented the financial trail Mitchell had uncovered, loans Margaret had taken, accounts she'd tried to squirrel away money in, shell transactions meant to obscure what she'd stolen from the company. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow. Her lawyer objected weakly, but the judge barely acknowledged him. Margaret's face tightened with every word, her once perfect posture collapsing into slouched defeat. When the gavel finally struck, the decision was clear. The company remained solely mine. The townhouse, awarded to me. All joint accounts frozen and divided equitably, which meant she got pennies, since she'd tried to hide assets. Spousal support. Denied, citing her misconduct. Margaret walked out of that courtroom with nothing but her name, and even that was worth little now. But the real masterpiece came a week later. Dan's disciplinary hearing before the state bar was open to the public. I made sure I was there, sitting in the second row with Mitchell at my side. Brianna came too, not because I asked her to, but because she wanted to see the truth played out in the open. The panel grilled Dan relentlessly, playing the recordings, reviewing the conflicts of interest, citing cases of professional misconduct. Dan tried to argue, but he was cornered at every turn. His arrogance, the same arrogance that had fueled his schemes, now made him look defiant and unrepentant. When the chair of the panel finally spoke, her words were sharp as glass. Mr. Carson, your actions not only breached the trust of your client, but also the ethical standards of this profession. Effective immediately, your license to practice law is revoked. There was no gavel this time, no ceremonial strike, just silence. Final and cold. Dan sat there, pale, his jaw twitching. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't look at Brianna, and he certainly didn't look at me. He just stood and walked out, shoulders hunched, a man stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. Margaret tried to follow him, but he brushed past her like she was a stranger. That's when Brianna leaned toward me and whispered, "He'll blame her, he'll leave her," and she was right. Within weeks, Margaret was alone. Dan moved out of the hotel they'd been holed up in, leaving her with bills she couldn't pay and a reputation in ashes. Word spread fast in their social circles. Invitations stopped. Business contacts ghosted her. Even her oldest friends distanced themselves, afraid of being tainted by the scandal. I made sure her debt notices were delivered promptly. Because remember that personal loan she'd taken, the one I'd quietly bought, she owed me. When the first payment came due and she couldn't meet it, she received a letter. Not from a bank, from me. The look on her face, I didn't see it firsthand, but Mitchell described it was pure devastation. She had plotted to bleed me dry, and now she was the one being asked to pay up, directly into my pocket. Brianna, meanwhile, stayed close. She came over more often, helped me around the house, asked about the business. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she raged, but she never drifted back to Margaret. I hadn't forced her to choose sides. Margaret and Dan had done that all on their own. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hand covering mine. "You were right," she whispered. "You told me not to hate him, not to waste the energy. But I can't forgive her. Not Mom, not after what she did." I nodded slowly. Forgiveness isn't owed, and sometimes, it's not even possible. But you don't have to let her define you. Her eyes glistened. She doesn't. Not anymore. It was then I realized something. My revenge wasn't just about tearing Margaret and Dan down. It was about reclaiming what mattered most, my daughter, my dignity, my peace. Margaret, on the other hand, spiraled. She sold her jewelry to cover expenses. Moved into a dingy apartment far from the upscale neighborhoods she once flaunted. Her calls grew more frantic. Her voicemails less coherent. "Alan, Please, just talk to me. We can work something out. I was angry. I wasn't thinking straight. Don't do this to me. I never responded. Don disappeared entirely. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd moved out of state. Others whispered he was drinking heavily, spiraling downward without his career. I didn't care enough to find out. His downfall was complete, and it was permanent. The final nail came 6 months later, when Margaret defaulted entirely on her debt. By then, I legally held the right to seize what little assets she had left, her car, her furniture, every remnant of the life she'd tried to build on my back. It wasn't anger I felt signing the papers. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was peace. Because in the end, Margaret and Dan hadn't just lost, they'd destroyed themselves. I had simply given them the rope, and they had hung their own ambitions with it. The thing about betrayal is, it doesn't stop when you catch it. It festers. It poisons everything the betrayer touches, until eventually, they destroy themselves. Margaret and Dan thought they could outmaneuver me. They thought I was weak, too broken to fight back. But by the time Section 7 of their little scheme came around, the game had already ended. They just didn't know it yet. When the divorce trial resumed, Margaret looked like a ghost of the woman I once knew. Her hair, once immaculate, was dull. Her clothes, once tailored to perfection, hung loosely, as though she couldn't afford her former lifestyle anymore. The fire in her eyes, gone. Dan wasn't at her side. Not this time. His suspension from practicing law had gutted her strongest weapon. She'd scrambled to find another attorney, but no one with real credibility wanted their name attached to hers. She ended up with a young, nervous lawyer, more paralegal than advocate. Richard leaned toward me before the judge walked in. His voice was steady, almost casual. "Alan, this isn't going to take long. She's finished." He was right. From the moment we began, Margaret was cornered. Richard laid out the financial paper trail. Mitchell had unearthed hidden accounts, personal loans, and proof of her attempts to funnel money into Dan's name. Each exhibit hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Her lawyer objected, fumbling through weak arguments, but the judge barely looked up. Every attempt to defend her fell flat. Margaret's composure shattered piece by piece. Her shoulders slumped. She bit at her lip until it bled. And when the final ruling came, she stared at the bench like she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. The company remained solely mine, the townhouse mine as well. Joint accounts frozen, then divided fairly, which meant she got scraps. Spousal support denied, citing her misconduct. The gavel struck, sharp and final. Margaret had fought for the world, but walked out with nothing. But I wasn't done. The real spectacle came at Dan's disciplinary hearing before the Bar Association. The room was packed, reporters, colleagues, even some of his old clients eager to see him fall. I sat in the second row with Mitchell. Brianna was beside me too, her hand clenched tight around mine. She didn't need to be there, but she wanted to be. The panel didn't hold back. They grilled Dan relentlessly, throwing the recordings in his face, dissecting every unethical move he'd made in my divorce proceedings. Dan tried to argue, tried to lean on that same arrogance that once made him sound persuasive in court. But here, it made him look unrepentant. His own words condemned him. Finally, the chairwoman of the panel leaned forward, her tone ice cold. "Mr. Carson, you've shown a blatant disregard for the ethical obligations of this profession. You manipulated proceedings, exploited conflicts of interest, and attempted to strip a man of his livelihood under false pretenses. Effective immediately, your license to practice law is revoked." Silence, heavy, crushing. Dan didn't move at first. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the panel like he could will them into changing their minds. But when he finally stood, there was nothing left of the cocky lawyer who once strutted through courtrooms. He walked out without looking at Margaret, without looking at anyone. And that's when Brianna whispered to me, her voice trembling but certain, "He's going to leave her. He'll blame her for this." She was right. Within days, Don vanished from Margaret's life. He checked out of the hotel they'd been living in, leaving her with mounting bills she couldn't pay. No note, no explanation, just absence. And Margaret, my once proud wife, was truly alone. Her friends disappeared quickly. No one wanted to be seen with her. Her social invitations evaporated. The high-class world she once flaunted slammed its doors in her face. And then came the debt. Remember that personal loan she'd taken out in desperation, the one quietly sold off to another buyer? That buyer was me. When her first payment came due, she received a letter. Not from a bank, not from a faceless corporation, from me. The reaction, I didn't see it, but Mitchell described it with relish. Her hands trembled as she read, her face drained of color. All her plotting, all her deceit, had led her to this moment. Paying me back with money she didn't have. She tried to call, I didn't answer. She left voicemails, her voice cracking, swinging between anger and pleading. "Alan, please, we don't have to do this to each other." I was angry. I made mistakes, but we can fix it. But there was no we anymore. Through it all, Brianna never wavered. She came to see me often, helped me with the business, even brought over dinner, some nights when I worked late. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes red but determined. You told me once not to waste my energy hating him, she whispered, but I can't forgive her. Not Mom, not after what she tried to do to you. To us. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. Forgiveness isn't owed, Brianna. Sometimes it isn't even possible. But you don't have to carry her with you anymore. She doesn't get that power. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. She doesn't define me. Not anymore. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. I had taken back my dignity, my company, and my peace. But more than that, I had taken back my daughter. Margaret's life unraveled in slow motion. She sold her jewelry just to keep afloat, moved into a dingy apartment far from the luxury she once basked in. Her reputation, as is her voice, once sharp and commanding, now cracked with desperation. Every time she left a message on my phone. The final nail came 6 months later, when she defaulted entirely on her debt. By then, I had the legal right to seize her last remaining assets. Her car, her furniture, even the artwork she once boasted about buying on our vacations. Signing the papers, I felt no anger, no thrill, not even satisfaction, just peace. Because in the end, Margaret and Dan hadn't just been destroyed by me. They had destroyed themselves. All I did was hand them the rope. And they hung themselves with it. Betrayal doesn't vanish overnight. Even after the courts, after the hearings, after Margaret and Dan were left in ruins, there were nights I woke up sweating, hearing echoes of their laughter in my dreams. The mind holds on, long after justice has been served. But slowly, the weight lifted. I'd walk through my office, I almost lost, and I'd feel something I had felt in years. Pride. Not the kind you flaunt, but the kind that hums quietly inside you, reminding you that what you built is yours. Not stolen, not manipulated. And when I saw Brianna, laughing again, helping me with small projects, or just calling to ask about my day, I realized. The true victory wasn't in Margaret's downfall. It was in what I got back. Margaret didn't disappear completely. Every few weeks, a voicemail would appear. Some were angry, venom still dripping from her tongue. Others were pitiful, her voice slurred, begging me to meet her, to talk, to give her another chance. But I never answered, because by then, I understood something vital. Engaging with her even to Gloatwood, VA, given her power she no longer deserved. Her silence in my life became the loudest victory of all. Months later, Brianna graduated from law school. Irony, isn't it? The same profession Don disgraced himself in was the one my daughter now entered with integrity, with strength, with a determination to never repeat the mistakes she'd watched destroy her family. At her ceremony, she stood on that stage, cap and gown shimmering under the lights. When she looked out into the audience, her eyes locked on mine. Not searching for her mother. Not hoping Dan would appear. Just me. And in that moment, everything came full circle. I don't pretend life is perfect now. There are scars, memories that sting. Trust doesn't come as easily as it once did, but maybe that's the point. Maybe betrayal isn't something you get over. Maybe it's something you carry like a scar that reminds you not of the pain, but of the healing that followed. I built my company back stronger. Not for Margaret, not even for revenge, but for me, for Brianna, for the future that had once seemed lost. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Betrayal can break you if you let it. It can strip you of everything you thought you were. But if you face it, if you refuse to let bitterness consume you, you can rise higher than before. Margaret and Dan thought they had written the end of my story, but they were wrong. Because I'm the one holding the pen, and I've only just begun. Betrayal hurts, but revenge done right can be powerful. If Alan's story kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe for more. And drop a comment because your story might be the next one we tell.